Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for, well, a real conceptual sparring match. One that really shook up 20th century critical thought.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We're diving deep into the work of Michel Foucault, specifically looking at his core ideas, power, knowledge, and how the modern subject ace basically gets constructed.
And we're framing it mostly through that famous clash he had with Noam Chomsky, that intense debate.
Exactly. That 1971 Dutch television debate, human nature, justice versus power. It really crystallizes their differences.
It really does. And our mission today, for you listening, is to use that fundamental disagreement, Chomsky's quest for universal justice versus Foucault's deep dive into power's history, to give you a clear path into Foucault's thinking.
Yeah, a shortcut almost into some complex but crucial ideas.
Definitely. If you really want to get a handle on how how power actually works today, this is essential stuff.
Okay, so let's set the scene for this intellectual showdown. Right at the heart of it, the absolute core of their conflict, is this huge philosophical question. It underpins everything else. Is there such a thing as a fixed, universal human nature?
Precisely. And for Chomsky, the answer is a clear yes. The foundation is immutable, it's structural, and really importantly for him, it's biological.
Right.
He insists, basically, that unless you have some kind of relatively fixed, biologically given, unchanging human nature, well, true scientific understanding just isn't possible.
So his whole career, whether it's language or politics.
Yeah, it's been about trying to uncover these stable, innate principles.
Yeah.
The deep structures.
He's looking for the governing hardware, you could say.
Yeah.
These principles that guide how we behave socially, intellectually in a unified way. Doesn't matter about culture or this specific time in history.
Right. He's very much in that Cartesian tradition, looking for a rational, almost physical basis for the mind.
And that structure, that's what lets us make sense of the world, create a unified experience from all the chaos of sensation.
That's the idea. If you follow Chomsky, without that fixed biological foundation, that deep grammar, that innate morality he talks about, then everything just dissolves. It becomes fragmented, arbitrary experiences. How could we compare different historical periods?
Or judge moral progress.
Exactly. Or even talk about a universal idea like freedom, if the very way we think about these things is constantly shifting. Chomsky needs that stable structure. It's fundamental to his linguistics and, crucially, to his political activism, too.
Okay. And Foucault, how does he respond to the search for a fixed human nature?
He basically avoids that whole line of questioning, sidesteps it entirely.
He doesn't engage with, does human nature exist?
Not directly, no. He's deeply suspicious of any claims to universal truths or fixed principles. He tends to see them as, well, tools. Instruments of control, often used by those in power to justify how things are.
So what does he do instead?
His response is always to historicize the abstraction.
Okay, let's unpack that for the listener. Historicize. What does Foucault mean by that, if he's looking at human nature or madness?
It means he refuses to search for the essence or the absolute truth of the concept itself. Instead, he shifts the focus completely onto how it operates, how it functions.
So not what is human nature, but how has the idea of human nature been used?
Exactly. How did it function in real social practices, in law, in medicine, in politics, in economics, over specific periods of time? He's not trying to define some unchanging human essence.
He's documenting the rules, the shifts, these sort of accidents even.
Right. The things that governed how different societies defined and talked about and controlled the human essence at different moments, what rules were in play.
So if a scientist says, I found the universal truth about human intelligence, Chomsky might say, great, a step towards a better society. But Foucault would ask.
Okay, whose power does this definition of intelligence actually serve? What institutions got built up to measure this, to enforce it, and who gets excluded by this definition? That's his line of inquiry. And he shows this, for example, when he looks at the beginnings of biology and economics back in the 18th century. These big ideas like life or human nature, they actually had very little impact on the internal changes within those scientific fields.
Really? They weren't driven by some grand discovery about human essence?
Not according to Foucault. Those disciplines developed according to their own internal rules, their own logic, their own objects of study. They weren't constantly checking back against some eternal truth about humanity.
That's a really crucial distinction. I mean, scientific disciplines get their authority, their structure, from inside the power systems they exist within. not from some pure objective observation of nature.
That's the core of it. His strategy isn't about finding some universal understanding that exists outside of history. It's about taking those claims to universality wherever he finds them and showing how reason or knowledge have actually functioned as social practices with different roles in our civilization.
Okay, so that massive philosophical gap, it inevitably leads to a huge political split, too. If you reject universal human nature, well, the idea of universal justice gets pretty shaky.
It certainly
So
does.
let's dig into that now. Our second core area, the political divide. If their starting points are just so different, what does that actually mean for politics, for justice, for the role of someone like an intellectual?
Well, for Chomsky, the political job is quite clear. It's goal-oriented, and it builds directly on his philosophy. The main goal is to work towards a truly just social order.
Rooted in those universal human needs he believes in.
Exactly. Rooted in rational structures where things like creativity and freedom can genuinely flourish. And the intellectual's role in
It's
this,
to use that standard, that universal human nature and reason.
right, to formulate a precise idea of what a more humane society should look like. Political action, for Chomsky, is fundamentally about the quest for justice. It's striving towards that better ideal.
He really believes we have this innate need for creative work, for free inquiry, and if society isn't delivering that.
Then the fault lies squarely with the corrupt social and political setup, not with science or technology itself. You need that ideal, that goal to aim for.
Okay. And Foucault's reaction to this.
Characteristically, he dismisses this whole approach. He sees it as, well, utopian abstraction, kind of beside the point.
Right, I remember reading how when people ask him why he was involved in politics, he'd refuse to answer that directly.
Yeah, he'd shift it. He'd talk about how he got interested maybe through concrete things like getting involved in prison reform movements.
And he critiques Western political philosophy precisely for being obsessed with these first principles, these grand utopian schemes,
Yeah.
building models of the perfect just society.
Exactly. And he argues that this whole focus on blueprints and ideal states, it leaves us almost totally in the dark, as he put it, about how power actually works on the ground.
It's a distraction from the real fight.
That's his view. Where Chomsky is looking toward the horizon, sketching the ideal society, Foucault is looking down. He's focused on the grit, the everyday stuff, the micro techniques of power.
How it actually operates in places like hospitals, schools, prisons.
Yes, his job isn't defining justice in the abstract. It's unmasking the mechanisms of control as they function in reality.
Now, this difference becomes really stark, doesn't it, when they talk about violence or standards for political action.
Absolutely critical. Chomsky argues, quite forcefully, that we must have fixed, rational, ethical standards. We need them to judge what a better society is.
Otherwise, how do you justify fighting?
Right.
Especially in, say, a revolutionary situation. How do you judge what others are doing?
Right. For Chomsky, you fight injustice in the name of something higher, something shared, namely justice.
And this is where Foucault drops perhaps his most radical bomb in that debate.
It is pretty startling. He explicitly calls Chomsky's idea of justice this fixed standard we use to measure progress. He calls it Nietzschean. But not in a good way. He means it in a really disconcerting, radical sense.
Yeah.
He suggests that the very idea of justice itself, it's an invention, something that was historically developed and then used as a tool, an instrument of political power designed to maintain a certain kind of social order.
Wow. Okay, but wait. If justice is just an invention, a tool of power, how does Foucault justify his own political action? His own fighting against power? Doesn't that just lead to a kind of anything goes relativism, where you can't condemn anything? That's the common criticism, isn't it?
That is absolutely the core challenge, and it's one Foucault wrestled with. He addresses it not by offering a new universal standard, but by completely reframing what politics is.
How does he reframe it?
He suggests we think of politics less like a conversation or a negotiation aiming for some shared ideal, and more like a battle, a confrontation.
Not a debate club, but a battlefield.
In a metaphorical sense, yes. For Foucault, you don't fight a battle primarily in the name of an abstract principle like justice. You fight because you're in the battle. You're opposing the specific forces that are currently dominating or oppressing you.
So the goal is tactical, immediate.
Exactly. It's about unmasking and resisting specific local forms of domination right here, right now. It's not about achieving some far-off abstract utopia called justice.
Okay, that explains how the local strategic resistance, but it still feels a bit uncomfortable on the why. Why resist this specific power, if not for some higher principle?
The why for Foucault is embedded in his analysis of how power and knowledge are intertwined, that power-knowledge dynamic.
Right. Knowledge isn't neutral.
Not at all. It's thoroughly tangled up in power relations. Knowledge isn't something outside these struggles looking in objectively. It's part of the machinery. It's a weapon, a tool used within the battle.
So Chomsky's idea that knowledge or science could somehow get free from power's demands and be a pure judge of justice.
Foucault sees that as dangerously naive. And, more importantly, historically just not true. He argues that relying on truth or science as if they stand apart from power is a misunderstanding of how things actually work.
And this is where he makes that move, suggesting we need to question the subject itself, the person doing the knowing. Why does the self need to be sacrificed, as he puts it?
Because that individual rational subject, the very I who claims to discover truth or define justice, that subject is itself a historical product. It's shaped by the very power relations Foucault is describing.
So the knower isn't a neutral starting point.
Not at all. It's the result of specific techniques, institutions, ways of talking about ourselves that have developed over time. So if you rely on that individual subject's reason or intuition to define justice, you're actually relying on something that's already been conditioned, already shaped by power.
Which is why he undertakes the genealogy of the modern subject.
Exactly. His whole project is about tracing historically how discourses, practices, knowledge, and power all weave together to create what we think of as ourselves. It reveals the subject not as a universal starting point, but as a kind of historical effect, a tactical outcome of power struggles.
Okay, so if we accept this idea that power doesn't just operate through the big state apparatus, but through these historical, local techniques that actually create the individual, we need to look much closer at how that happens. How are we shaped?
Right.
Foucault, later in his work, actually summarized this by identifying three modes, he called them, by which human beings are turned into subjects, made into the kinds of individuals we are.
Yeah, it's a really useful framework he offered.
Let's break those down. What's the first mode?
The first mode, which connects a lot to his earlier work, like Madness and Civilization and the whole idea of the Great Confinement, he called it dividing practices.
Dividing practices. That sounds on the surface like a simple political tactic, create an us versus them. How is Foucault's idea different from just talking about class conflict or ethnic division?
It's more specific. Foucault shows these dividing practices are processes of, yes, division, but also classification, control, and often spatial exclusion. And crucially, they often rely on some kind of claim to truth, often mediated by science or administration, not just brute force.
So it's not just separating people, it's defining them through that separation, often by putting them somewhere specific.
Exactly. The human being gets captured in this systematic process of objectification and constraint, often by literally placing them somewhere distinct. It gives them an identity through division.
Can you walk us through an example? How did this evolve historically?
Well, think way back to the isolation of lepers in the Middle Ages. That was a pretty stark early form of spatial exclusion, separating the sick based on religious ideas, fear of contagion.
Okay.
But then that system gets replaced by something much more complex, which he calls the Great Confinement, around the 17th century. Think of institutions like the Hôpital Général in Paris, founded in 1656.
And that wasn't just for lepers or the sick?
No, that's the key shift. It brought together a whole range of people, the poor, the unemployed, the insane, vagabonds, all confined together.
Why? What was the logic behind that? It sounds like a big change from just isolating lepers.
It was a profound shift. The old exclusion was often about religious purity or fear of disease. The 17th century confinement, Foucault argues, was an early administrative move. It was focused on things like social utility, economic normalization, getting unproductive or troublesome people off the streets.
So it started classifying people.
Yeah.
Creating categories within that confined mass.
Precisely. It took this undifferentiated group of undesirables and started sorting them madmen, delinquents, the idle poor. It created distinct identities for them through the very act of grouping and containing them, and this process just kept evolving into the new ways of classifying diseases in the early 19th century, the rise of modern psychiatry, the clinic as a space of observation and classification, and later, as he details in The History of Sexuality, the whole system of stigmatizing and normalizing sexual behaviors, defining deviance.
Okay, so dividing practices. Systematic, often spatial or administrative ways of constraining people, using a kind of quasi-scientific logic to give them identities by grouping and controlling them. Got it. What's the second mode?
The second mode he identifies is scientific classification.
So turning people into objects of science.
Exactly, but often independent of that immediate physical confinement, though it might lead to it later. Here, Foucault tracks how the human being becomes an object of inquiry in the emerging human sciences, especially around the classical age, 17th, 18th centuries.
And he saw this happening in specific fields.
Yes, he identified three core examples where the human became an object of knowledge in a new way. First, the speaking subject studied in what was called grammaire générale, then philology, then linguistics.
Okay.
Second, the productive subject, the person who labors, who creates wealth, analyzed in classical economics.
Right.
And third, the living subject, the biological organism analyzed in natural history and later biology. These fields tried to define the universal features of human life, language, work, life itself.
And what's really interesting here for Foucault isn't just that these sciences emerged, but how they changed. His focus on discontinuity.
That's absolutely central to his method, yes. He shows how these disciplines did develop a kind of internal logic over time, but they didn't progress smoothly. They lurched forward through these abrupt shifts, these conceptual breaks or ruptures, especially around that classical age.
Which fundamentally changed the rules of the game, how we even think about language or work or life.
Completely. That's the critical insight of his genealogical method. He's not just tracing a smooth evolution of ideas like a traditional historian might. He's highlighting the breaks, the discontinuities.
And showing how those shifts were connected to things outside the science itself.
Exactly. Embedded in non-discursive practices, the institutions, the power structures, the social realities of the time, those things enabled one way of thinking, one conceptual system, to collapse and be replaced by a totally different one. He shows when the way we conceive of ourselves changed radically, not arguing why it was somehow destined to change.
Okay. Dividing practices. Scientific classification. That leads perfectly into the third mode, which feels maybe the most Foucaultian, especially in his later work. Objectification.
Yes.
So, we've been constrained from the outside, categorized by science. Now the person themselves gets involved, actively making themselves.
That's it, precisely. Subjectification is the process where the individual actively takes part in their own formation, turning themselves into a subject through their own actions, their own thoughts.
How does that work?
Foucault traces this through what he calls a long and complicated genealogy of practices, operations people perform on their own bodies, their souls, their thoughts, their conduct, ways of shaping oneself.
This sounds less like being forced and more like ethics or self-discipline, like monks practicing self-denial.
It has elements of that, yes.
Yeah.
But crucially, it's nearly always mediated by power in some way. Foucault argues this self-formation often involves or even requires some kind of external authority figure. Like the confessor in the Christian tradition, the spiritual director, or much later the psychoanalyst.
Think about the 19th century French bourgeoisie, which he analyzes in detail. He showed how this explosion of scientific and moral talk about sex became absolutely central to how people understood themselves.
It wasn't just about having sex.
No. It became about needing to categorize yourself, to understand your desires, your impulses, to figure out if you were normal or perverse based on your inner life, your thoughts, your behaviors. And this culminates, of course, in Freud and psychoanalysis.
So the drive to confess, to analyze your deepest desires, to define yourself based on this internal world, that's subjectification, an active self-shaping.
Yes, but it's prompted and guided by these external authorities, medical, psychological, religious, who provide the categories, the frameworks for understanding.
So you actively shape yourself, but according to rules and categories provided by a power structure. Exactly. The very act of self-examination, that urge to define and scrutinize your inner self, is what leads to this self-formation. And that process, in turn, reinforces the power of the institutions, the doctors, the therapists, the priests who provided the language and the norms in the first place.
Which is why subjectification and dividing practices often go hand in hand.
They're often intertwined, yes. You see it clearly in history of sexuality or discipline and punish. The individual gets categorized from the outside, like being labeled delinquent or homosexual, and is simultaneously encouraged to understand and manage themselves internally according to that category. It makes them a more predictable, more manageable subject.
Okay, so this shift in how individuals are understood, categorized, and even how they understand themselves, it must demand a totally different way for the state to operate, right? You can't just rule by decree anymore if the individual is this complex object of science and self-management.
Absolutely. The old models of power just don't fit.
And this transition brings us right into Foucault's Really groundbreaking analysis of what he called governmentality and the emergence of biopower.
Right. When we typically think about power, especially pre-modern power, we think of the sovereign, the king, the law, the
The
territory.
power to decree, to punish, ultimately the power over life and death.
That's the classic model of sovereignty. The sovereign controls the land and has the right to take life or let live. But Foucault argues that starting around the 16th century, a new, continuously evolving form of political power began to develop. One focused not just on territory or law, but on administering life itself. He calls this new rationality governmentality.
Governmentality. What made this new art of government, as he sometimes called it, different from old school sovereignty?
The main difference was the object of power. The focus shifted. The state started thinking about itself not just in terms of its rights or its land, but by looking at the population, the interests of individuals, families, groups within that population, their relationship to wealth, resources, health.
So it became much more fine-grained.
Definitely. This led to loads of treatises in the 16th and 17th centuries precisely on the art of government, how to manage people, goods, wealth within a territory.
So it wasn't just about the prince and his relationship to his kingdom anymore. It was extending down into the details.
Much more invasive, yes. It brought political reflection down to the level of the household, the family. And crucially, it became concerned with managing the state's resources, what we now call the economy. This was a really profound shift.
Society itself becomes the target.
Society and all its component parts, population, health, economy, become specific targets for political intervention and management. The goal, the justification for power, shifts from simply maintaining sovereign right or territory to the proper management of men and things, as one writer put it, ensuring the continuation, the health, the prosperity of life within the state.
And this intense focus on managing life, resources, populations, that's the bedrock for what Foucault sees as the defining characteristic of modern power: biopower.
Exactly. Biopower is this new regime of power that really takes hold in the classical age, 18th century onwards, and its focus is squarely on life. Modern humanity, Foucault famously wrote, becomes an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question.
So biopower isn't just about the sovereign's right to kill. It's about managing life,
Yeah.
optimizing it.
Yes, managing it, controlling it, making it productive, maximizing its potential. And this new power, Foucault says, operates through two distinct but connected poles.
Okay, what's the first pole?
The first pole focuses on the species body, the population as a biological entity.
So big picture stuff.
Right. Demographics, birth rates, death rates, public health, longevity, managing epidemics. This requires large-scale, sustained political intervention. You need statistics, censuses, public health campaigns, social welfare systems. The overall health and statistical trends of the population become a central concern of the state. Politics becomes, in a sense, biological management on a mass scale.
Okay, that's the macro level. What's the second pole?
The second pole zooms right in on the individual human body. This is the pole of discipline.
Back to discipline and punish.
Exactly. Here, the individual body is treated as an object, something to be manipulated, trained, observed, controlled. Foucault talks about technologies of the body, techniques aimed at making the body more efficient, more predictable, more useful.
The goal being to create what he called the docile body.
Precisely. A body that is subjected, used, transformed, improved through drills, exercises, schedules, spatial arrangements, all those micro techniques you find in armies, schools, workshops.
We really need a concrete example to see how this disciplinary power works. And Foucault's key example, the absolute paradigm of this modern disciplinary technology, is Jeremy Bentham's panopticon.
The panopticon is brilliant in a terrifying way. It's the architectural diagram of pure, efficient discipline. Imagine a circular building. Around the edge are individual cells. In the center, there's a watchtower. Each cell has two windows, one on the outside wall letting light in, the other on the inside wall facing the central tower. This setup means that anyone in the tower can, potentially, see into any cell. The inmate is constantly silhouetted against the light.
But the inmate can't see into the tower.
Exactly. Because of blinds or partitions in the tower, the inmate never knows if they're being watched at this specific moment. They know they could be watched at any moment.
And that's the genius or the horror of it, the efficiency. The power works, even if there's no guard actually in the tower.
That's the crucial psychological shift. The inmate, uncertain if the gaze is constant or intermittent, starts to police themselves. They internalize the surveillance. They become, as Foucault puts it, the principle of their own subjection.
Power is exercised by the person being subjected to the system because they regulate their own behavior constantly.
Right, it functions automatically. Foucault notes that power, in this setup, becomes almost perfectly efficient and impersonal. It's like a machine that runs itself.
And this is where we have to step outside the literal prison design. Foucault saw the panopticon as much more than just an architectural plan.
Oh, absolutely. He called it a generalizable model of functioning, a political technology, a diagram of power that could be detached from the prison and applied anywhere.
There's schools, hospitals, factories.
Exactly. Think about the layout of classrooms, the observation in hospitals, the assembly line in factories. They all use elements of this panoptic principle. Spatial partitioning, visibility, hierarchical observation, and encouraging self-discipline through the possibility of being watched or assessed. It organizes people, makes them accountable, makes control efficient. #V, normalization, totalization, and the political double-bind.
Okay, so this model of control, the spatial setup, the constant potential visibility, the efficiency of discipline, this is what underpins the next huge concept in Foucault's analysis. Normalization, the shift from ruling by law to ruling by the norm.
Yes, the rise of these disciplinary technologies marks a really profound shift away from the older style of sovereign power. Sovereign power often relied on spectacular, public displays, the execution, the punishment to assert its authority. Normalization is much quieter, more pervasive, more continuous.
So under normalization, it's less about obeying a specific law and more about conforming to a standard, a norm.
That's the core idea. Individuals get distributed around this norm. Their behavior is regulated through these continuous, often subtle, corrective mechanisms, rather than just through obeying the king's command or a legal code.
So power doesn't just say, thou shalt not kill. It says, this is the standard of acceptable behavior, and you deviate from it at your peril, or you need correction.
Exactly. Foucault summed up the old power as ni roi ni loi, neither king nor absolute law in that sense. That's increasingly replaced by this kind of spreading normative rationality. The formal legal system, the juridical institution, gets more and more integrated into or even overshadowed by these other apparatuses, medical, administrative, educational.
And these apparatuses function based on norms, standards of health, sanity, productivity.
Precisely. Their power lies in their ability to qualify, to measure, to assess, to hierarchize, to place individuals along a spectrum, defining them by their deviation from the norm, rather than just punishing transgressions against a law.
And for normalization to work, Foucault argues, it actually needs to create difference. It needs the abnormal.
It absolutely requires the systematic creation and management of anomalies within the social body. You can't establish a norm without simultaneously defining what falls outside it, what is abnormal.
So the very purpose, the justification for these normalizing systems comes from their ability to identify these anomalies, the delinquent, the pervert, the mentally ill, the underperforming student, and then claim to be able to correct them to bring them back towards the norm.
Yes. And this is where biopower and normalization really mesh together. Think about the explosion of categories of abnormality in the 19th century. All the increasingly specific types of mental illness, criminal profiles, sexual perversions. Foucault argues this wasn't just science discovering pre-existing truths.
It was the machinery of normalization defining its own targets, creating the very categories it claimed to treat.
That's his controversial but powerful argument. It was the mechanism defining what needed to be managed and controlled.
And underpinning all of this, the discipline, the normalization, is a massive amount of paperwork, documentation.
Absolutely essential.
What?
The rise of the dossier, the file, the case history, this huge documentary apparatus, it allows authorities to fix individuals, to record their deviations, to categorize groups, to calculate statistics about the population.
To measure the gap between individuals and the norm.
Right. And this results in this incredibly detailed, comprehensive, what Foucault calls totalizing, web of knowledge and control.
And there's that constant tension, isn't there? The more the system knows about you, the more detailed the file.
The more power it has to specify you as an individual case, yes. Power becomes more effective precisely because it individualizes, because it gathers all the specific data.
The more detail in the dossier, the more the state knows the individual, and the tighter the connection between that individual and the system, often through their own records, their own documented history.
And this leads us right to what Foucault identified as a key feature and maybe a key problem of contemporary power, what he called the political double bind.
Okay, what's the double bind?
It's that power today operates in two ways simultaneously. On the one hand, it totalizes. It manages the population as a whole, using statistics, large-scale policies, demographic analysis. That's the biopower poll we talked about.
Managing the species body.
Right. But at the very same time, it individualizes. It specifies each person through norms, through categories, through detailed records, through disciplinary techniques.
So we're simultaneously part of a statistical mass and treated as unique, documented individual cases.
Exactly. We're objects of broad population management and, at the same time, subjects of intense individual scrutiny and normalization.
And this is a really crucial takeaway for you, the listener, isn't it? Foucault is saying we can't just escape this double bind easily. The problem isn't just fighting the state in some abstract way.
No, it's much deeper. He argues we need to figure out how to liberate ourselves both from the totalizing grip of the state and its institutions, and also from the specific type of individuality that those institutions impose on us, the identity they create for us.
The identity that links us to the state through those very categories: patient, student, citizen, worker, deviant.
Right. We have to refuse the forms of subjectivity, the ways of being an individual that have been imposed on us over centuries, the idea that our truth lies in our sexuality or our psychiatric diagnosis or our economic productivity.
That's the real challenge Foucault leaves us with. It's ethical, it's political.
Yeah.
It's about questioning the very definition of who you think you are. Okay, so if power is this diffuse, pervasive thing, working through science, through administration, shaping our very identities, where does that leave the critic, the person trying to fight back? If Foucault rejects grand utopian blueprints, what was his idea about his own role, or the role of any intellectual engaged in politics?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and Foucault is very explicit about rejecting the traditional model of the universal intellectual.
The kind of figure who speaks for everyone, in the name of universal truth or justice.
Exactly. Think of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre in France. The intellectual as a kind of moral prophet, standing above the fray, speaking truth to power in the name of reason or humanity, claiming to represent the conscience of society.
And Foucault thought that role was finished, obsolete.
Pretty much. He argued that, by his time, that function had basically been taken over by a different group of people. Technical experts. Technocrats. The people who manage complex systems. Nuclear engineers, economists, policy analysts, bioengineers. They are the ones who now claim to speak with authority, but they do it in the name of objective data, technical necessity, efficiency, future progress.
They're the new prophets, but they speak the language of management, not philosophy or universal justice.
Right. So Foucault proposed a different model, one he felt was more relevant to this age of biopower and technical expertise. The specific intellectual.
Okay, what defines a specific intellectual?
A specific intellectual is someone who uses their specialized knowledge, gained from working within a particular sector of the system, maybe they're a doctor, a historian, a sociologist, a physicist, to analyze and critique the power relations and the mechanisms of control operating in that specific sector.
So it's localized.
Yeah.
Tactical, not trying to speak for all humanity.
Exactly. Their expertise gives them insight into a particular institutional reality. Their goal isn't to climb some philosophical mountain and design a perfect society. It's to get down into the trenches, use their specific knowledge to unmask how power actually works, how institutions function, how violence operates, right? Where it's experienced by people on the ground, the patients, the prisoners, the workers, the students.
So his own work, looking at madness, clinics, prisons, that was him acting as a specific intellectual, using historical analysis.
Precisely. He positioned himself not as some timeless philosopher, but as a strategist, almost, engaged in immediate struggles over how life is governed, working on local issues, using detailed, specific knowledge, not aiming to change grand ideas about justice, but to understand, for instance, how does the disciplinary system in this particular prison actually function? What are its effects?
This stance also connects to Foucault's really interesting and kind of paradoxical questioning of the whole idea of the author, doesn't it? Given how influential he himself became.
It does. Just as the universal intellectual gives way to the specific intellectual, he saw a shift in the function of the author figure, especially comparing science and literature.
How did he see that changing?
Well, historically, he noted, in fields like science or medicine, a text often needed the authority of a specific author's name to be considered true. Think of Galen or Ptolemy.
Right.
But once scientific disciplines developed strict procedures, methods of verification, what he called a threshold of formalization, The authority shifted. It became vested in the procedures themselves, the methods, the established scientific consensus.
The individual author's name became less important than whether the work followed the accepted scientific process. Truth became more anonymous.
Exactly. Whereas in literature, he argued, something like the opposite happened. In the Middle Ages, stories and epics often circulated without much fuss about who wrote them. But by the 19th century, the figure of the author, the literary genius, became hugely important. Invested with authority, seen as the source of the text's meaning and value.
So truth became more anonymous in science and more personalized around the author figure in literature.
That was his observation. However, he did identify a very specific and quite rare category he called founders of discursivity.
Founders of discursivity. Okay, what makes them different? He mentions Marx and Freud as examples. How are they different from, say, Einstein or other major thinkers?
This is a really subtle but important idea. Founders of discursivity, like Marx or Freud, don't just produce specific theories or texts. They establish whole paradigms. They set up a framework, a set of core concepts, images, methods, problems that fundamentally structures how we think and talk about huge domains of experience, like society, history, or the psyche.
So their influence goes way beyond just agreeing or disagreeing with their specific claims.
Right. You can reject, say, Freud's specific theory of the Oedipus complex. But if you're working in psychoanalysis, you're still operating within the broader discursive field he established, talking about the unconscious, desire, repression. Their work opens up a space for an indefinite number of future texts, future arguments that are still in dialogue with the original framework.
And that's different from someone like Einstein in physics.
Very different. You don't necessarily need to go back and reread Einstein's original papers to do contemporary physics. His discoveries have been absorbed, formalized, built upon, maybe even superseded by the ongoing scientific work. The discipline moves on.
But with Marx or Freud, Foucault suggests, you almost have to keep returning to the foundational texts to modify, critique, or extend the discourse they founded.
Exactly. They created these unique kinds of discursive systems, particularly prevalent in the human sciences, that constantly refer back to their origins, while also allowing for endless internal development and transformation. And of course, these are precisely the kinds of knowledge systems that are deeply entangled with the power-knowledge dynamics Foucault is always analyzing.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, where does this deep dive leave us, the listener? We started this journey comparing Chomsky, who's searching for fixed principles of justice. And we end with Foucault, this specific intellectual, meticulously examining the hidden, anonymous machinery of power.
Yeah, it's quite a contrast. I think the core insight, the main takeaway for you listening, is that Foucault really pushes us to shift our focus. Stop asking what is justice in some abstract, universal sense.
And start asking, how does power actually work? Concretely, historically.
Exactly. He gives us the tools to see how these pervasive techniques of governing people, discipline, normalization, biopower, haven't just constrained us from the outside. They've actively created the very idea of the individual, the subject that we often take for granted.
Making us, in a way, complicit in the systems that manage us.
That's the unsettling implication, where Chomsky looks for universal principles like reason and justice to use against oppression. Foucault tries to unmask the specific local ways power operates, arguing that knowledge itself is always part of the battle.
And to see that battle clearly, Foucault suggests we might need to sacrifice the comfort of believing in those universal ideals. His work is really a strategic toolbox for understanding and resisting power locally.
It really is, and it's this enduring call for a relentless critical look at rationality itself, how reason, historically, hasn't always been a force for liberation, but has often become a very sophisticated mechanism of control.
Which brings us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you to take away. Foucault was deeply skeptical of grand historical narratives, anti-Hegelian, critical of how reason has often functioned. So the question is this. If that very search for first principles, for universal knowledge, the kind of search we often think of as the highest intellectual or ethical goal, if that search has, as Foucault argues, often served mainly to hide the real micro-mechanisms of power, can we ever achieve a truly critical perspective, a real understanding of our situation, without first letting go of the comfort, the security of thinking in terms of universal reason or innate human nature? And maybe ask yourself, what parts of your own identity, your own self-understanding, how you define yourself in terms of health, normality, intelligence, productivity, legality, are actually products of the very disciplinary systems, the very categories that Foucault spent his life analyzing? Something to chew on, perhaps, the next time you find yourself being categorized or categorizing yourself.